Welcome to Unit 3, which is on listening and the skills and comprehension necessary to effectively communicate. Each of us has varying degrees and proficiencies in the language arts, and today we're going to look at listening, a unified group of skills necessary to effectively communicate, as I said already, in both synchronous and asynchronous environments. Oftentimes it's hard to determine if we have a hearing loss or mumbling, as both of these are rampant today, especially with the excessive use of headphones, concert attendance, loud music, and so on. Those things are oftentimes the norm. So if we think about ourselves, are we better listeners or speakers? Is that something that can be taught and improved with time and effort? What activities did you do growing up that might have contributed to your relative strength, or perhaps where you have a relative weakness? Do you cut off people in their communication with you? Do you try to predict what they're going to say? Whether or not you do those things, you probably have come across those instances in other people and in your communication with them. So it's always better to listen first and then respond appropriately. So another thing that's somewhat common is having misheard lyrics. We oftentimes listen to music. I know in the 90s I was a Smashing Pumpkins fan, and there was a song that came on, and I had no idea he was talking about it was a rat in a cage, and for the life of me I couldn't figure it out, and Google wasn't around. That was popular at the time anyway. So it wasn't until I actually listened to the lyrics being said at a radio station that I was brought into what the lyrics actually were. So our agenda today is going to look at the Levine article, some activities where we can promote listening comprehension, and talking about its relative importance within the language and literacy field, as well as how do we assess it and what are some techniques to be able to instruct others to become more proficient in listening. So as we already asked, can listening skills be improved, and if so, how? So there are tips and tricks out there, but the first one we're going to look at is eye contact and nonverbal cues. Now, of course, these differ from culture to culture. So for instance, in the US, generally the length of eye contact can be longer than in other countries. So when we show each other eye contact, that's generally considered to be a good thing here in the US, showing attention to the speaker, showing that you're interested and you have genuine interest in what they're saying, as well as having confidence and boldness, as opposed to looking down or away, whereas that's considered rude and inattentive. In European countries such as Spain, France, and Germany, for instance, it can be considered more flirtatious and avoidance in crowded, unfamiliar places such as subways, etc. And still in other places like the Middle East, there are strict rules about eye contact between opposite sexes. Whereas in Asia and Latin America and Africa, extended eye contact can be seen as challenging authority or confrontational. If we do a practice, so we're going to do a practice to see how well you listen and how well you're able to remember the sequential steps in this process. So I'd like you to close your eyes for a moment, and I'm going to read a passage, and then I'd like you to see if you can remember the sequence of events that transpires. So the passage includes the following. Changing a ribbon on an old portable typewriter can be murder. First, you need to pry open the top of the machine. Then take out the old ribbon. As you do it, you need to watch and make sure you remember exactly how the old ribbon fitted in. Take the old ribbon to the store with you, because sometimes you can't go by the name on the typewriter. Show it to the person in the store and get the same kind if possible. You need to unravel the new ribbon and fit the end into the old spool. Next, you try to get the new ribbon back in the same route the old one came out of. Finally, you put the top back on and see if the machine works. If it doesn't, you start all over again and hope for the best. So now take a look to see if you were able to remember those sequence of events. And if you weren't, perhaps that's an assessment that you need to practice some of these tips we're going to talk about today yourself. The scope and sequence of listening skills according to Levine includes the following. First, we need to determine the purpose for listening and trying to guess or estimate the other speaker's purpose. And then we need to think about sequence of ideas and noting details and following directions and so forth. And then we get further and further, as opposed to, let's say, point 13, where we're looking at distinguishing between relevant and irrelevant material, or noting emotional appeals, or predicting possible text questions, or predicting outcomes, and so on and so forth. So these are skills that develop and build upon one another. So if we were to define what is listening comprehension, we must say that it involves the building of an understanding of individual words and sentences beyond one single word, beyond one sentence, to comprehend an overall message and to construct a mental model from that listening experience. Fisher and Frey note that as we increase with age, there comes a point where listening comprehension and reading comprehension meet, meaning that you no longer listen better than you can read and comprehend what you read. And that point in time has historically been noted at around 14 years old, or about 8th grade. With that said, one of my colleagues, Dr. Wolfram Berlon, for his dissertation, found that this actually occurs much sooner today, that around 4th grade, students become more proficient at reading than listening comprehension, as indicated by the red dot that I've included on this chart. So why are people perhaps worse at listening in their teenage years, but better readers? Your guess is as good as mine. But some potential reasons could be that with the advent of more multimodal technologies and so forth, people's attention spans has waned. So if we go to the next slide, we're talking about why might these listeners have been better in years past as opposed to today. And of course, we think that this is environmental, as I mentioned. With time, listening comprehension accounts for a greater variance within reading comprehension. So in the younger years, how well you comprehend a book is more about word recognition. But over time, it's more related to listening comprehension in the older years, such as audiobooks, MP3 files, YouTube clips, etc. If we know there's a significant relationship between listening and reading comprehension, don't you think that listening comprehension should be given more attention? And in fact, in the Common Core State Standards, there are indeed standards listed for reading. Those have been the similar ones written for the last 30 years or so. However, there are other ones where it talks about preparing for and participating effectively in a range of conversations and collaborations with diverse partners. Those are distinctly related to listening comprehension, and therefore they must be a focus of our instruction. Further, attention to diversity is something that's also been newly added. Do we think that our parents' generation were better listeners or speakers, and why might that be? It's probably more proficient as speakers in one period or another, perhaps based upon the instruction or the environment in which they lived. However, these comprehension and collaboration standards make it very clear that speaking and listening in a proficient manner is required for career and college readiness. So if we think about how is listening comprehension assessed, there's a bevy of approaches from informal reading inventories, such as the IRI, as well as the Durrell analysis of reading difficulty, which is one of my favorite tests. There's other prepackaged tests from other publishing companies, as well as alternative language tests too, such as Spanish ones that are commonly used in the US right now. The way that listening comprehension is assessed is you typically read grade level passages aloud to students. They are not able to look at the written piece themselves. They're simply able to listen. You follow up with some oral questions, and as soon as they miss 2 or more questions in a given grade level, that's where they cap out at and they become frustrated. So the grade level before that is where their listening comprehension actually lies. We also have some listening and speaking rubrics that can be used. For example, does a student demonstrate that he or she can listen attentively to other speakers? Or do they speak clearly? Or are they active participants? Or can they encourage others? And these are things that can be both peer assessed as well as self-assessed, and even from a teacher. So how can listening skills be further fostered? Well, some activities include reader's theater. Oh, the places you'll go. More scripts available by my good colleague, Dr. Chase Young from Sam Houston State University. His website is www.thebestclass.org. It is the most extensive list. It houses the most extensive list of reader's theater passages for you to use freely. Also through demonstrating presentations and having listening stations, right? With headphones and MP3s and iPods and computers and so on, can all be used to ensure that students are pushed forward in terms of their listening prowess. We must also think about how listening fits within oral language as a whole. So we know that instructional strategies can relate to conversations and think alouds, but it also can be other things such as wait time or think, pair, share, teaching new words, and think, talk, and writing, and repeating what others have said, like talking in synonyms, for example. And we're going to look at some of those shortly. The first is conversations. This is defined as having 5 or more exchanges with another person. And so conversations are rich discussions in which you pick up indirectly new vocabulary words, you're able to pick up meaning from others, and you're able to learn with and from one another. And that is the greatest opportunity to learn in your entire life, more so than explicit instruction or anything else, is conversing with others about content in the world around us. So of course this can happen between student to student or even student to teacher, as well as at home with their families. We know that vocabulary development is a byproduct of conversations, and extending those conversations with questions is definitely best practice. For example, can you tell me more about that? Or how do you think that happened? Here's an explicit example where the teacher says, "You found something." "I got a stick." "That's a twig. Wow, it is skinny. Where did you find it?" "Over there by the tree." "I wonder how it got on the ground." "It fell off the tree." "Maybe the wind blew it off the tree." "Yeah, haha, whoosh goes the wind." Those sorts of conversations and extensions from questioning is essentially what allows conversations to be relevant, and also for students to make gains in listening and speaking ability. Another in-class activity is a think, pair, share, which you may be familiar with, where a teacher asks students to independently think for a moment about a particular content. And then she says, all right, discuss in a pair before they would share as a whole class into the larger group, so that everyone learns from that initial thought and that initial pairing and sharing with one other person. Ways to begin meaningful conversations: you can encourage students to look at cues such as, "I agree with such and such because of that," or "I'd like to add X," or "Couldn't it also be that such and such?" And those things, again, cue readers, cue students back towards expressing themselves appropriately within content disciplines. Other instances include accountable talk. So this is entirely based on evidence and is particularly appropriate in science and history and mathematics, where you say, "I don't know what you mean by this," or "based on my evidence, I think this is the case. I agree with Sally because she used this evidence base." All those sorts of things are what we consider accountable talk. There are other sentence starters that vary from nonfiction, such as "I discovered," or "I learned," or "now I understand why." And this is a printout sheet that's oftentimes used in the lower elementary grades. Another is think alouds. I do this oftentimes just by myself, actually, but it's particularly relevant to working with students of all ages. So a teacher might say, "The water is sinking into the sand really quickly. I want the water to stay on the sand, not go away. I wonder where the water goes." There's air between the grains of sand, and the water soaks into the air spaces fast, so the water doesn't stay on the sand. It soaks away, right? That porous nature of sand allows that to happen. And so just thinking aloud is actually a teaching tool all by itself. And that's encouraged, and that encourages, rather, students to listen. And then to build vocabulary, we have a strategy called define, do, and revise. So in math and science, for example, there's lots of confusing vocabulary and jargon. And this strategy can particularly help when students revise their initial definitions later on with pictures and words and examples that make sense to them. And in turn, they take ownership. So they would define what the word means in language, and then they would involve using this word in different contexts, and then they would go over in the different ways in which the word is actually used. Here's an example of this in practice. So Rachel is doing a measurement in math, and she has noticed that the children were unsure of what the term measure actually means. So to make learning meaningful, students measured how tall they were, measured their feet and their hand sizes, and to reinforce that learning, Rachel made reference to measure at different times throughout the day. And to extend that learning, she talked about other forms of measurement, such as time and temperature. And again, that's able to connect the dots, and students able to develop additional information upon their pre-existing schema. And then another strategy is called the think, talk, write. And it's derived from some of the other strategies, such as the think, pair, share strategy, but it really is used to assist children to get down their thoughts onto the page. Oftentimes, learners have difficulty expressing themselves on the paper through their own writing. And this is definitely one strategy to help with that. And then the last two strategies include questioning and questions, which is invitational prompts from the teacher, which can also be doubled up. So if I were to ask you, who is the character in this book who's the protagonist? And then that student who answers the question could then ask another student a following question from that. And that would be considered a double question. And these are also supported by wait time. And wait time is really the 3 to 7 seconds that we allow students to think about our questions before we call on a student. So you don't want to just call on the first person that raises his or her hand, because then it doesn't hold every student responsible for the learning. And this is going to improve responses in the number of which they do, the length, and the quality of responses within your